right. Well, thanks to all of you for coming to this episode of VMware Carbon Black's Office Hours. This one specifically is on audit remediation best practices. My name is John Nelson. I am a global field principal solution engineer here at Carbon Black VMware. I've been with the company for over 5 years. I came over in the Carbon Black acquisition, but I do come from kind of a non-traditional background in this space. So before Carbon Black, I started late in life as a solution engineer at RSA. But before that, I was teaching for the government outside of Baltimore to all the secret squirrel agencies down there, teaching computer forensics, network investigations, and malware analysis. And prior to that, I retired as a corporal from the Pennsylvania State Police, where I conducted computer crime investigations for over 13 years. So really more of a practitioner than a solution engineer, but my investigative background and my teaching background lends itself very well to this role. And especially when we start diving into this topic, because I will admit, I am the unmitigated fanboy of audit remediation. I love this product. It is such a powerful product, and we'll be getting into all of that as we move through the presentation. So first, we're going to jump into some poll questions to try to find out, how you're using the product and specifically about queries. And so the first one is, where do you get the most queries that you run? So we're looking to try to find out where you like to pull your queries from. And some of these things you might not know about, such as a query exchange, and we'll touch more on that before. But I'd really be interested to hear if you're writing your own, or maybe there's some other place that you're pulling your queries from. I would love to know about that as well. So we're going to give this about a minute, and then we'll all be able to see the results of this. There are a ton of recommended queries in the product, and those are a really good starting place for queries, but definitely not the end all be all. I know that there's about to be a huge influx of some more recommended queries in the product. Some are being changed, and there's a bunch being added. And that is, I think, by the end of this month, maybe. But yeah, there should be some there soon. Okay, so we have the results. So pretty even split between writing your own or getting them out of the recommended queries. I love that people are writing their own. That's awesome. That really warms my heart. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Do you struggle to find queries for your use cases? So, a lot of customers that I do struggle to find queries for their use cases. And, some people, like I think it was 47% that wrote their own, are, jumping in and writing their own queries, which is awesome. But, this best practices session is kind of go through and talk about how I like writing queries and how I think the best way to write queries is. And so hopefully those of you who haven't written queries before, you'll be empowered to do so after this session. So I think this one is a pretty quick one to answer. So hopefully the results come up quickly here. Yep, okay. So 75% of people are struggling to find queries that help meet their use cases. That's kind of a bummer. But hopefully through this presentation, we'll help you figure out how to meet your use cases, or at least give you the resources to figure those out. So this one I'm really curious about, because the Windows event logs haven't always been in the product. But they did get added, and this is a super powerful capability in the product right now. This is probably the one that I talk with customers about the most, because of the power of this. And this is not just straight up window event logs like the security log or the system log or the application log. It's any log that you see in Event Viewer, you can query through audit and remediation. So Sysmon, if you have Sysmon turned on and enabled, you can query Sysmon logs. So it's super, super, super powerful. And it's something that a lot of people don't know about. So, I'm interested to see how many people answer yes to this one. So only 17% of people are actually querying Windows event logs. Now, that might be because we have people on in the webinar that don't have Windows machines, but for those that do have Windows machines, this is, again, incredibly powerful. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is very briefly, what is audit remediation? We're going to talk about leveraging OSQuery and what OSQuery is. We're going to talk about some of the limitations of audit remediation that you need to be aware of. We're going to do a very quick demo of the things that we've talked up to that point. And then we're going to play Stump the Chump. So what this is I'm going to give you the ability to ask me questions. So those of you that answered that you struggle to meet your use cases, if you have a use case that you haven't been able to find a query for, that's your time to ask that question. And depending upon the complexity of the query, I'll try to construct a query in real time to meet your use case. If it's too complex, or you actually are stumping me, I will take it offline and work on it, and then you can reach out to me later and I'll provide you with the answer to that query. Then with the remaining time, we'll take some Q&A, and that could be really anything VMware Carbon Black related. It doesn't have to be focused on audit remediation. Okay, so let's get into this. What is audit remediation? So audit remediation empowers our customers to query over 2,000 individual attributes of their endpoints, and that's across Windows, Mac, and Linux. And not only those 2,000 individual attributes, but all permutations of them, because of the way that we can construct queries, we can draw correlations between the different tables in the product. And the reason why we can do this is because audit remediation is built on top of OSQuery. And so OSQuery is a fabulous open source project that was created by Facebook because Facebook looked at the market and said, there's not a product that is enabling us to do real-time queries in the way that we want to do them and to collect the data that we want to collect. So they created this open source project, OSQuery. Now, we saw the value in OSQuery, so we took that, removed all the management headache of running OSQuery and slapped a UI on the front of it to enable you to run queries at scale across your entire infrastructure. Now, OSQuery itself is built on top of SQLite. And so as long as you understand SQLite, everything else is gravy. If you don't know SQLite, there are many resources out there to help you learn that super powerful language. One of them, I believe, is SQLitetutorial.net. But if you just Google SQLite tutorial, you can find any number of resources to help you start writing the queries. And I'm going to provide you with access to a best practices guide that I wrote and that'll be towards the end. And there's information in there about that tutorial, as well as talking about some SQLite basics that will help you in writing your queries. But because it's based on SQLite, you can use joins to bring those correlations across tables in audit remediation itself. Now, because audit remediation is built on top of OSQuery, I like to leverage OSQuery to write all of my queries before I use them in the product itself. So believe it or not, we're not going to see audit remediation in this webinar today, because from my perspective, there's a better way to construct queries if you're writing your own. So the reason why I use OSQuery is, one, it gives me immediate results. Like, I am not the best typer. I'm a hunter and pecker, and I've got really fat fingers. So when I make mistakes, I do it in OSQuery, I see my mistake immediately. And so I can then go and fix my mistake immediately, then realize, okay, I did it right this time. And so iterate on that. And that really helps me with my queries. Now, if I was doing this in the UI, well, I construct a query, I put it in, I think it's right, I submit it, I have to wait for the sensor to pick it up, run the query, send the results back, then I see them in the UI, realize I made a mistake, fix my query, send it off again, and just keep doing that. So there's a lot of latency in that. With leveraging OSQuery, I can eliminate all that latency. Another huge benefit of using OSQuery is you can see all of the warnings and errors. You see some of them in the UI, but not all of them. And so when you see all the warnings and errors, then you have a much better indication of maybe why your query is not exactly correct, and it's much easier to fix things when you're seeing them. And all of this together really improves and limits the time spent developing your queries. And when you're trying to meet use cases, and especially if you're just learning SQLite, you're making a lot of mistakes. But in using this method, you're going to see that you can really iterate on this very quickly and come up with some really, really valuable queries. So if we want to leverage OSQuery, the first thing we need to do is to be able to install the right version of OSQuery. And to answer Dave's question, I just saw it in the chat. In the UI, audit remediation is the live query section. You are correct. Audit remediation is made up of live query and live response. So it's a standalone product, but if you have other Carbon Black products like Enterprise EDR or Endpoint Standard, the NGAV piece, you already have live response. So yes, it is the live query piece. That is absolutely correct. But so if we're going to use the correct version of OSQuery, what this tiny URL is it'll take you out to the Carbon Black user exchange, and the user exchange will this page on the user exchange will show you what the current version of OSQuery is for the different sensor versions in the different operating systems, so that you can go and you can look at those and you can see, okay, which version do I need to install so that I can construct my queries. Now, the reason why we want to install the correct version is that this product is constantly evolving and new tables are being added, or there are fixes to older tables. And so it's really important to check out the schema and make sure that you're on the right version in the schema page, as well as installing the right version. Let's just take a quick look at the schema itself. And so here we're on the schema. You can see here's the query version. Currently in Windows, I believe we're on 5.2.3. So I would change that to 5.2.3. If we scroll down through here, let's see if there's any new tables in this version. I can't remember if there were any. Nope, let me find a version that had some new tables. Oh, there we go. So anytime there's a new table, you're going to see that little new badge on there. And that's going to tell you that there's a table for that version, a new table for that version. But as you can see, there's over 273 tables. You can filter this schema for the different operating systems that you're interested in. They're also indicated over here by these little icons. But there are, as you can see, just a ton of tables that we can leverage to pull back data. And, you know, since this is an open source project, you know, our Carbon Black is a good steward of the open source community. We like to contribute back. And so we've contributed a couple tables back to the project. One is the Windows event log table. And the reason why we contributed that when there's already this Windows events table is that this Windows events table is what is called an evented table. Evented tables require storage of data locally on the endpoint. And we did not implement evented tables in Audit Remediation or LiveQuery. So because this is such a powerful data set, what we did is we wrote the Windows event log table that does not require an evented table. So we gave our customers the ability to leverage Windows event logs. We also improved the Yara table. Before the Yara signature had to be local on the endpoint, we gave it the ability to actually use the signature in the query itself or query it from a URL. And then we also added the Win base OBJ table. So anybody who does malware analysis on Windows, you know, leveraging mutexes to go out and find malicious processes, this table gives you the ability to go out and query mutexes on your Windows endpoints at scale. So super powerful stuff. But again, you know, the schema here is very vast. There is a ton of great stuff that we can query against. So hopefully this is even expanding your use cases more than what you had before. And then finally, we're going to open up OSQuery I. So when you install OSQuery in Windows World, install and program files, you go into program files, there's going to be a OSQuery i.exe and a OSQuery.exe. We want to use OSQuery i.exe, which is an interactive shell where we can write our queries. Before we get into actually looking at OSQuery I, let's talk about some limitations that we have with Audit Remediation and or LiveQuery. So first is queries are limited to a maximum memory usage on the endpoint of 500 megabytes. You know, this is a very powerful tool, but if you write queries that are computationally intensive, we're trying to help you not shoot yourself in the foot. And so that's why we put that 500 megabyte cap on there. And so if it exceeds that 500 megabyte threshold, then the query is going to get terminated and you'll get an error in the UI. And so all that means is you need to go back and take a look at your query and maybe make it a little more specific about the data that you're trying to collect as opposed to a much broader collection. So Dave asks, is OSQuery installed on an endpoint as part of the CB sensor install? It is, but it is a protected binary. So you cannot run it on the endpoint. You can't just leverage it to run queries. So that's why you need to install it additionally. It's a very small install, doesn't take up a lot of resources at all, and is not running if you're not leveraging OSQuery I. So it just bits on the disk, really. We're just doing it to get access to OSQuery I. So it's not running as a service or anything like that. So we don't have to worry about that. So the query payload is limited to a size of 1 megabyte. So all the results that come back, if it's greater than a megabyte, then it'll get truncated without warning. So we have to think of audit remediation live query as we are querying data. We are not collecting data. We're not using it to go out and collect a list of all the files on a file system or all the hashes on a file system. If we start trying to do things like that, then we're gonna run into these truncation issues. We are just talking about text, so 1 megabyte of straight text is actually quite a lot. So you shouldn't run into this unless you're running queries that are returning a tremendous amount of data. So that's just something to keep in mind. We want to be very prescriptive about what we're looking for, as opposed to casting a huge wide net. The user interface itself, and so this is the live query interface, limits the number of results shown in the interface to 10,000. Now there are ways around that. One, there is an export button on the results page, and you can use that results or that export button to get all of the results. So above and beyond the 10,000. You can also use the live query API, which is documented at developer.carbonblack.com to pull back all of the results as well. And that's one great thing about all VMware Carbon Black products is they all have very robust two-way APIs. And so you can do super powerful things with the live query API and extend the product to do things that aren't available in the UI. So you can really extend the product to do some really amazing things. Queries that take over 900 seconds are terminated. And so what we see this happen a lot, there's people leveraging the Yara table are not being as prescriptive as they should be. And so they're trying to run a Yara query against an entire file system. Those will typically time out, both from potentially exceeding memory usage, but also because the query is taking so long to return. Another one is people trying to search for a hash across an entire file system. Sometimes those can time out as well, because all of those hashes are being generated on the fly as it's going. And so it can be a memory issue, it can also be a timeout issue. And then last but not least is, again, reiterating, there is no support for the evented tables in OSQuery. So with that said, we're going to jump into a quick demo of OSQuery I. And so here it is. You can see just running OSQuery drops you into a command shell. And here I am running a command, select star from file where file name is like exe. And so for those of you not familiar with that, so a like is enabling me to use wildcards, and the percent sign is a wildcard. So this is essentially looking for any file that has a file name that ends in .exe. And so I run my query. Oops, I can't run that query because the file table is one of those tables that requires a specific column in the where clause. And so because I've run this before, I know my mistake and I forgot to include a path. So I have to tell it where on the file system I want to look for this. And so now when I add a path in, and so here I'm looking in program files in Notepad++ directory, and with a single percent sign, this is looking in that current folder. If it was a double percent sign, that would be recursive and would look in all the subsequent subfolders. But when we look at these results are kind of hard to understand because the results are so long that it's actually wrapping around on the screen. So what we can use is we can change our mode, which is how we are viewing our results. And so I'm going to change this to the line mode. And so you can see here, I'm using dot mode, which is a special command in OSQuery. And I'm telling it to change it to the line mode. So as opposed to the pretty mode, which is the unpretty view with all this data, now I'm in line mode. And so I can actually see it a lot better. And so when I look at this, first of all, there's a lot of data in here that I don't need for the reason why I'm querying this. But there is some data that I would like. So things like the path and maybe the UID and the GID and maybe the MAC-B times, all the time date stamps. But also when we look at these time date stamps aren't very helpful in their current format, but they're pretty easy to convert into a human readable form. So now you can see I've changed my mode back to pretty. And now I am choosing which columns I want to return. And so I've chosen path, UID, GID, and I'm using a function called datetime. And so the datetime function is going to change the column in the first line here, is going to change the column A time from Unix epoch time, which is the number of seconds from January 1st, 1970, to human readable. And I'm also going to have it display in local time. And then I want that to be the column, I want it to be A time again. If I left off this as A time, then the column would be named date time, A time, Unix epoch, local time. It would have all of that in there. So using this as, which is an alias, I am just renaming that column back to A time. And so I do the same thing with B time, C time, and M time. And in the results, so now we can see we're getting results that are much easier to read and has all the data that we want in it. Now we can extend this even further, and I'll leave this as an exercise for you to take on your own, but we have a UID. Well, maybe we want to actually know what that username is. Well, you can do a join with the user table and translate that user ID into an actual username. So, using joins can be incredibly powerful and bring a lot of capability and context into your queries. And you could do the same thing with GID as well. Now, all of this stuff, there's a question in the chat. Oh, resource links. Thank you, Annette. So all these links that I am going to talk about here, Annette just put into the chat. So one is the best practices guide that I've written. It covers some of what I've talked about here, but it's pretty in depth. It goes into a lot of ways into writing queries and adding context in. It talks about the date time function and things of that nature. It's a really handy thing, especially if you're trying to write your own queries or meet your own use cases. So I suggest you check that out. That's available in a couple different locations, but right now I think it's the best place to find it is on TechZone. I also wrote a query blog series, which is out on the Carbon Black website as well. And so this is a series of, I think, 6 different blog posts where I go through starting out with a use case and building out queries to meet those use cases. So talking to a lot of depth about how I built out those queries. There's always the query exchange. The query exchange is actually really unique in VMware Carbon Black in that it's actually open to the public. You don't have to be a Carbon Black customer to be able to contribute to the query exchange or take queries from the query exchange. So if you are using recommended queries, the query exchange is another great resource where you can go out and let's just take a look at it real quick. So here's the query exchange. Right now, there is 18 pages. There are 10 queries per page, so roughly 180 queries in the query exchange right now. So a lot of really powerful queries at your fingertips there to really help you meet those use cases that maybe you're struggling with, because maybe someone's already contributed a query that does it, or maybe doesn't meet it exactly, but it will give you at least a good starting point. And all you really need to do for those is copy and paste those into the SQL tab in live query to be able to run them. So with that, we're going to play Stump the Chump. So again, this is, if there's a use case that you're struggling with, I'd encourage you to throw that into the chat and we can start taking a look at that. I'll drop out of presentation mode and I have a Mac here, I have a Linux VM, and I have a Windows VM, so that we can, go in and however you want to, or whatever use cases you're struggling with, we can try to work on them live in this session. So again, when I'm writing queries, again, using OSQuery, here I am in that interactive shell. If you type .help, you can see that there are some other dot commands. We talked about the .mode command. And so here's all the different modes that you can output data in. It's very easy to cut and paste in here. And so, you know, when you're writing queries, you can just start typing them out. Now, tables, you can actually tab complete the tables. The columns you can't tab complete. So if we do star from process, and so if you keep hitting tab, it'll show you all the possible completions. So I'm going to choose from processes. And so again, we get a lot of data out. If we're trying to write a use case on the process table, we can struggle with that because it's, again, there's a lot of data here. It's hard to see, and there's a lot of results. So one thing I like to do is use limit. So if I do limit, and we'll just do limit 1. So it's only going to return 1 result. So I can kind of look at that result and say, okay, this is all great, but I need a little more data because this is a system process and there's not a lot of things returning here. So maybe I want something where the path is not blank or the command line is not blank. So we can add a where clause to our query here and do where path. And we can either say not equal using the word not, or we can use exclamation point equal. They're both of those are the same thing. So now we're saying we want to find processes where the path is not empty to equal to an empty string. And so now when we run it, now we get back and we get actual data here. So that's a little more helpful. But again, it's hard to read because there's so much data in here. So if we change our mode to line, and we just up arrow, run our query again, now we get it in this format. And so this is a little bit easier to see. And so then we could go down through here, look at the values that are in here and excuse me, which columns do we actually want to bring back? So then we can actually start writing our query out and pulling back only the columns that we want to bring back. Let's see. So Dave asks, once he constructs a query, can he import that into the UI to be a permanent, repeatable query, or does he have to copy and paste it each time he wants to use it? So you only have to copy and paste it once. And let me go into the, wait a second here. So here we are in our query results. So I've got tons of queries in here that I've run. You can see all the way back to June 14th, 2021. So the queries stay in here forever. The results don't, but the queries do. So if for whatever reason I wanted to run this query that I ran so long ago, I can just choose to rerun that query. I can schedule it, I can duplicate it, or I can delete it. So if I want to edit it, I can just duplicate it. And then, you know, I ran it before on all policies. Well, I could come in and change that policy, or I could change it to specific endpoints. And then I can modify the SQL if I need to and run it again. So the queries will always stay in the UI. It's just after 30 days, the resultant or the results get discarded, but the query always stays. So hopefully, Dave, that answered your question. So, again, it's very simple to take a query off of the query exchange. So let's just click into one of these queries. So we have a query here. We just copy that query and we can go back into the UI, into that SQL tab, paste it in, give it a query name. Oops, I totally forgot what I was copying here. So let's see what we got. So we just copy this as well. Then we can choose the endpoints that we want to run this on and kick off that query. So again, now that we've pasted this query in, it's running. If we go into our results, this query will always be here. We'll just eventually lose the results, but the query is always going to be there. The hyperlinks drop off of here because the results have dropped off. So the underlying query is still there, so you can easily run that again. Now, for me, like when you look at this type of query here, right, we're getting to be a little complex here. There's a lot going on in this query. And so what I do is I have a scratch pad here. And you can see I write a few queries. Again, I am the unmitigated fanboy of this product. So I'm constantly writing queries for my customers and for other customers and for pretty much anybody who asks me to write a query, I write a query for them. So I have this scratch pad. Now this is Microsoft Code, which is a great IDE. And so I have this set up to be SQL. So this also does syntax highlighting. So I know this really helps me with my fat finger problem. So if I forgot a quotation or I'm using a wrong term or I made a misspelling, it's pretty easily seen. So I can quickly dive into that and then once I have my query down, I just go paste it into OSQuery, run it, make sure the data is coming back the way I want it, and then take that data and take the resultant query and put it into a live query. So we could take a quick look at a use case. Let's look at Windows event logs and how we could create a query with Windows event logs. Let's jump back into my VM here. And so so when we look at Windows event logs is another one of those where you need to tell it which event log you're looking at. Now, with the standard Windows event logs, those are easy. You're just going to use application or security or whatever. But let's look at Event Viewer real quick. And so, like I said before, you can query any event log that shows up in here. So you have all of these event logs, but you have, oops, why is it not expanding? Everything always breaks in a demo. There it goes. So any one of these log sets, you can take a look at. So I'm just grabbing a random one here. We need something that actually has data in it. Let's see if we can grab a better one. Okay, so if we wanted to query this specific Windows event log, this is our log name here, which is something that we would use as opposed to the other log name, like security. So we can go back and let's take a look at the security one. So I'm going to jump back to my PowerShell. And so let's select star from Windows event log, where now this is a little confusing, but the log source, we need to, its column name is channel. So channel equal security, and I'm going to limit this to 1 because it's going to come back with a lot of data. So again, because it's coming back with a lot of data, and our query starts right here, by the way. So again, it's coming back with a lot of data. Having it in line mode is a little more helpful in this case. Now we see we have some things here in column data. So we have a date timestamp. We have the event ID. We have the computer name. But then we have this data column. This data column has a lot of data in it, even more data than the other columns. Now this is in JSON format, but it's really kind of hard to read here. So we're going to use our friend Microsoft Code again. I have this, I just created a file called test.json, and I set up the file format in JSON. And so when I paste, when I paste my data in here, it's still all in one line. But the nice thing about this is I can come here and I can click on the ellipsis and I can see the JSON by using this mechanism, and I can really see that data in there. Now, this logon type 5, so we can go out and Google this, but we don't really want to see logon type 5 because these are system events. We're looking for user events. So we don't want to look for, I believe it's 4 or 5. Eliminate that from our query. So I go back to my VM. So let's look for things where, so we did where already, so we need to use an and here. And so we're going to look for, now I have that logon type and it's in the JSON data. So we actually have to use something called JSON extract to get to that data set. So we can focus on a specific piece of it. Now we could use like, but that can, using the JSON extract is going to make more sense and is going to show you how you can individually target things in the data. So if we use JSON extract, and we are looking at this certain data, but we have to tell it that we are looking at, Windows event log, and we're looking at the data column. And we are specifically wanting to look at, and there's a special syntax for this. So we're doing $ dot, and then this, the JSON blob starts with event data. So we are doing event data, event data, and we want to look at the logon type field. Oops, so I spell right. Need a quote there. And we're going to say not equal to 5. And so now when we run that, yep, it messed it up. It's always fun to do this stuff live. So it's probably because it's outside of a quote. It is an actual integer. Putting it in a quote means it's a string. So this is probably a string value as opposed to an integer value. So now let's look at our logon type. So, okay, there we go. So we got that to work. We got logon type 2. And there's a little bit more information in here. So if we grab this JSON blob, and go back to MS Code, change our JSON blob, take a look at this. So now you can see that we have the target username, we have the target SID, we have the logon type, and there's one other thing. There's one other value in here. I'm struggling to see it. Shoot. Well, we can talk about that later. But you can see that there are now pieces of data that you'd want to pull out of there. And so you can use that JSON extract to pull that data out so that you can have it in your queries. And so that you can then start pulling back more data for your queries. Now let's look at this logon type here, right? So we have a logon type of 2. Well, what does 2 mean, right? So if we go out and let's just Google Windows event log on types. Let me try, let's do this search because I'm looking for a specific, there we go. That's a little bit better. So if we look at this, where did our chart go? There we go. So here's our logon types. So we see, interactive 2, network 3, batch 4, service 5, and so on. We can actually use, this is covered in the best practices guide, we can actually use a case statement to go through and convert the logon type from a 2 to it's saying interactive. And so in the present, because we're coming up on time here, I just wanted to show you that this query is in the query exchange. And so you can go out there and take a look at it in the query exchange. And you will be able to take a closer look at it, and everything's been done for you there. I just got to get to the right page. I think it's on the 3rd page. So it's right here, Windows logon failures with the login reason and type decoded. I will grab this URL and stick it into the chat for you. So now you all have that. But with that said, I saw the poll come up for the feedback session. So I think that's my cue that we are coming up on time, and that you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to jump back into our presentation. So again, that poll popped up on your screen. If you could give us some feedback on that, we would really appreciate it. You can also stick any comments you want to in chat. You know, I don't think we have any time for questions, but feel free to throw anything in there and we can answer them if we can. But in the presentation, I think Annette is also throwing these into the chat as well, that there are some also additional VMware Carbon Black resources for you. And, you know, as Annette already said, I do love queries and I kind of get wrapped up in things. So sorry if I prevented us from going through Q&A, but I do really appreciate your time today. And I personally had a lot of fun talking about this, as I always do. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.